June 24, 1948, 6 a.m. The control room at the Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst, East Berlin. A Soviet officer reached for a telephone and issued a simple three-word order to the railway switching stations surrounding the city. Within minutes, the steel arteries that kept 2.5 million people alive began to seize up. Locomotives hauling coal from the Ruhr were halted at the sector border. Barges carrying grain on the canals were turned back. On the Autobahn, Soviet soldiers lowered the red and white barriers, telling confused American truck drivers that technical difficulties required the road to be closed indefinitely. In his office in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin wasn't waiting for a battle report. He was looking at a spreadsheet. His advisors had done the math, and the math was lethal. West Berlin required 4,500 tons of supplies every single day just to survive at a subsistence level. It needed 1,500 tons of food and 3,000 tons of coal. Without coal, the power plants would stop. The sewage pumps would fail. The city would freeze and go dark. Stalin knew that the combined air transport fleets of the United States and Great Britain could lift at maximum effort, perhaps 700 tons a day. The gap between 700 and 4,500 was the difference between life and death. It was a mathematical impossibility. Stalin wasn't trying to start World War III. He was waiting for the inevitable surrender. He calculated that the city had 36 days of food and 45 days of coal. After that, the West would have to hand over Berlin or starve the very people they claimed to be protecting. What Stalin didn't know was that he wasn't fighting against a military strategy. He was fighting against an industrial algorithm. He believed he was laying siege to a city. In reality, he was flipping the switch that would turn the United States Air Force from a weapon of destruction into the greatest logistics corporation in human history. He had calculated the tonnage perfectly, but he had forgotten to calculate the stubbornness of a general named Lucius Clay and the logistical genius of a man named William Tunner. To understand the arrogance of Stalin's gamble, you have to look at the map. West Berlin was an island of democracy deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. It was indefensible. There were no walls yet, only lines on a map. When the blockade began, General Lucius Clay, the American military governor, called Washington. The response was panic. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to pull out. They argued that staying in Berlin was a military liability. They suggested retreating to the West German border. Clay slammed the phone down. He knew that if the United States abandoned Berlin, Europe was lost. The psychological blow would shatter the fragile confidence of the West Germans, the French, and the Italians. Communism would sweep the continent not by force, but by the sheer inevitability of Soviet power. Clay issued a directive that terrified his own staff. We stay, period. But staying required a miracle. The only access to Berlin that the Soviets couldn't block were 3 narrow air corridors, each 20 miles wide. Under a 1945 agreement, the Soviets had guaranteed air safety in these lanes. Stalin didn't shoot down the planes because that would mean war. He simply assumed the planes wouldn't matter. The first days of the Berlin airlift were a disaster. It was a cowboy operation. Pilots were flying C-47s, planes that were leftovers from World War II, capable of carrying only 3 tons. They were flying around the clock, exhausted, uncoordinated, landing in chaos. Crews were sleeping on crates of flour. Maintenance was non-existent. By July, they were managing 1,000 tons a day. It was heroic, but it wasn't enough. The city was slowly dying. The rations in West Berlin were cut to 900 calories a day. People were fainting in the streets. This was the moment Stalin had predicted. The impossible math was winning. Then, the Americans brought in the weapon Stalin hadn't accounted for, Major General William H. Tunner. Tunner wasn't a combat hero in the traditional sense. He was an efficiency expert. He had run the hump airlift over the Himalayas during the war. He looked at the chaos in Berlin and saw an engineering problem. Tunner arrived in Wiesbaden and immediately grounded the cowboys. He imposed a system so rigid it resembled a factory assembly line. He synchronized the entire operation to a stopwatch. He calculated that to hit the tonnage requirements, a plane had to land in Berlin every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather. He standardized the flight paths. Aircraft would fly in through the northern and southern corridors and fly out through the center one. It was a one-way loop. He ordered that pilots were not allowed to leave their cockpits when they landed. Instead, jeeps with coffee and sandwiches would drive out to the planes while German crews unloaded the cargo in record time. A C-54 Skymaster could be unloaded, refueled, and back in the air in 30 minutes. But the real breakthrough was the data. Tunner realized that food wasn't the biggest problem. Coal was. Coal is heavy, dirty, and corrosive. Dust from the coal sacks was getting into the electrical systems of the aircraft, shorting out instruments. It was grinding cables to dust. The pilots were flying blind in planes that were slowly being eaten from the inside out. Tunner didn't stop. He ordered the floorboards removed to save weight. He had the coal crushed into dust and packed in surplus army duffel bags to maximize space. He turned the C-54s into flying dump trucks. Stalin watched this from Moscow with growing unease. The numbers were climbing. 1,500 tons, 2,000 tons, 3,000 tons. The Soviet military began to harass the flights. MiG fighters would buzz the transport planes, flying head-on and pulling up at the last second. They shone searchlights into the cockpits at night to blind the pilots. They conducted live fire exercises inside the air corridors. It was a game of chicken played with nuclear stakes. One mid-air collision could start World War III, but the American and British pilots didn't flinch. They kept flying the rhythm. 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes. The drone of the engines over Berlin became the heartbeat of the city. West Berliners called it the air bridge. The crisis point came with the winter of 1948. Berlin winters are brutal. Fog, ice, and freezing rain. Stalin's meteorologists assured him that the airlift would collapse in November. Visual flight rules would be impossible. The planes would be grounded. The city would freeze. And they were almost right. In November, the fog was so thick that pilots couldn't see the runway lights until they were 50 feet off the ground. Accidents mounted. Planes crashed into embankments. Men died in burning wreckage in the dark German woods. Tonnage dropped. The city began burning furniture and trees to stay warm. But Tunner countered with technology. The Allies brought in ground-controlled approach, GCA radar, a cutting-edge system that allowed air traffic controllers to talk a pilot down to the runway blindly. Turn left 2 degrees, descent rate 500 feet. They were landing 30-ton aircraft in zero visibility, guided only by a voice in their headphones. By January 1949, the impossible math had flipped. The airlift wasn't just meeting the minimum requirements, it was exceeding them. The daily tonnage crossed 5,000, then 6,000. The ultimate humiliation for Stalin came on Easter Sunday, 1949. Tunner decided to break the spirit of the blockade once and for all. He organized the Easter Parade. For 24 hours, the airlift went into overdrive. They eliminated every inefficiency. They maximized every payload. On that single day, the Allies landed 12,941 tons of cargo. A plane landed in Berlin every 62 seconds. They delivered more coal in one day than the trains used to deliver before the blockade. The Soviet liaison officers at the Tempelhof airfield watched in silence. They weren't seeing planes anymore. They were seeing a demonstration of limitless industrial power. They realized that the United States could do this forever. They could rebuild the entire city of Berlin by air if they had to. Stalin's calculation had a fundamental flaw. He understood the physics of hunger, but he didn't understand the physics of freedom. He assumed the West Berliners would riot against the Americans when the food ran low. Instead, they rallied. When the French built a new airport at Tegel in just 90 days, thousands of Berlin civilians, men, women, and children, worked around the clock with their bare hands to clear the rubble and level the ground. They weren't victims of the blockade. They were combatants in it. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union quietly capitulated. The barriers on the Autobahn were raised. The trains started moving again. There was no announcement of defeat. The Kremlin simply stated that the technical difficulties had been resolved. Stalin had aimed to starve Berlin into submission in 3 weeks. Instead, the blockade lasted 322 days. The Allies flew 278,228 flights and delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies. 79 American, British, and German personnel died in crashes to keep the city alive. But the legacy of the impossible math went far beyond the city limits. Stalin's blockade achieved the exact opposite of his strategic goals. He wanted to drive the West out of Berlin. Instead, He cemented their presence there for 40 years. He wanted to keep Germany weak and divided. Instead, his aggression terrified the Western powers into forming a military alliance. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was signed in April 1949, 1 month before the blockade ended. It was a direct response to the siege. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was founded shortly after. Stalin had tried to strangle a city, and in doing so, he breathed life into the alliance that would eventually destroy the Soviet Union. The deep dive into the logistics reveals a terrifying truth about the Cold War. It wasn't always about who had the biggest bomb. It was about who had the best spreadsheets. The airlift succeeded not because of courage alone, but because of the boring, unglamorous mastery of supply chains. It proved that in the modern era, logistics is the deadliest form of warfare. When Tunner's planes were landing every 62 seconds, they were sending a message to Moscow that no diplomat could deliver. They were saying that the industrial capacity of the free world was inexhaustible. The lesson isn't that technology solves everything. The lesson is that miscalculating your enemy's resolve is the most dangerous error a leader can make. Stalin looked at the map and saw a trap. Truman and Clay looked at the same map and saw a stage. The Berlin airlift remains the greatest humanitarian operation in history, but it was also the first decisive battle of World War III. It was a battle fought without bullets, won by pilots who carried flour instead of bombs, and decided by a math equation that Joseph Stalin simply couldn't solve. He bet on the weather. The West bet on the will. And in the cold gray skies over Berlin, the will proved to be the stronger force.